Mary, that was great. You're exciting as a person. You're invigorating. You know, you're a gifted communicator. One of the basic rules of using something like PowerPoint is you don't give out in advance what you're going to cover. Yep. And so you're going to see that that's exactly what I'm doing, is giving it out. And the reason I decided to do it is that there was no way you're going to be able to take notes well on this. It's a little bit too much material to do that well, and I could cut back the material, but then it would be less helpful for you. Okay? So I decided to go ahead and give this to you, and then we'll put this on the website along with the audio and to whatever extent we get the video of this session worked out. So I'm Quentin Schultze. I teach at Calvin College. I occasionally teach at the seminary. I do some guest lay preaching here and there. I do a lot of public speaking. I've cut back on it because it takes so much energy to do it well. You know that. And the older I get, the more I find that I can't do as much of it if I want to do it well. I've always been interested in technology. I am a bit of a technology guy myself. Okay? It's just, I don't know where it came from, but I love technology. It's like a kid with toys, you know? But I'm also in communication, so I know that often technology does not serve the purpose of communication. It gets in the way. And so I'm always interested in how can we use new communication technologies to actually improve communication. And sometimes that means not using it. Sometimes it means using it wisely. And I'll talk about both of those. I'm going to focus on using PowerPoint type technology, that is projected. The reason I'm doing this rather than, let's say, video with a lot of moving image stuff is because it's a very different game to use video. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's much more complicated to do that well, for reasons I'll explain. Okay, so I have a former student that likes to do caricatures of me, and you're going to see a couple of those. I've got all kinds of them. He puts these in different things and sends them to me. That's your phone? Okay, then that's not a problem. So what we have here is the view of how he says I view myself. All right? A rather righteous, some would say self-righteous person. And then he says, if it's going to work here, come on, you rascal.
Sorry.
Why would this suddenly not work? Ah, come on now. There we go. He says, this is how a lot of my students see me. Okay? So you've got two views there. You got two images. One of myself and the other of how other people might view me. Obviously, he does it with a little bit of humor. He's trying to be funny. But I begin there because this is a very important point for you to think about. The way people will view you using technology in worship is generally different from the way you think they view it. And so to use it well, you have to get into their shoes. You have to empathize with them. What do they bring to it, given the rest of their lives? How are they going to respond immediately to something simple? What's the meaning that they're going to find in this? Not what's the meaning that you think you're putting into it. So you have to be focused on the congregation to use technology well. And I would say the single biggest mistake that people make in using anything like PowerPoint is they're using it for what they want to say, not what they want the congregation to hear. Okay? And then we'll run through some examples. I think this is going to work, Mary. This is... Okay. So first thing I do on a topic like this is to say, I want to find out what's out there already that people are doing. I don't want to rely just on myself. So I maintain research files from different places where they're using PowerPoint type technology. Churches that are using it, companies that are selling the technology. This is one of them. PowerPoint preaching, the whole shebang. Click here. There you go. And so you go into this website, PowerPoint 4, the number 4 back there, preaching.com. Now these are some images I took from their site. But what I thought it would be helpful to do is to start with what not to do, and then move into what to do. And so I took one of their sermons, which they put into PowerPoint. You buy the whole sermon. The whole thing is in PowerPoint. You know, you talk about shebang. Wow, this is it. You don't even have to write your sermons. It's all ready to go. Read off the screen or whatever. So I took one, and I made a few adjustments to it visually here and there and orally and put it together so you could do a 20-minute sermon in 1 minute. And here we go. This thing will not work on that, so we'll work it over here. Here we go. That's Mary's phone. Obviously, I added that image at the end. What's going on here? I have been in churches where it was not very different than that. And believe it or not, many of the oral elements of that were already in it. I added a few of those. All of the movement was already in it. As if this is somehow a magic bullet that if you just fire out there into the congregation, boy, they're all going to be obedient to the Lord and filled with the Holy Spirit and so on. This is the craziness that's on one side of this that we have to avoid. And so I begin with 10 reasons not to use it. This is not the end. We'll get to the reasons to use it. And they're simple reasons. Technological snafus. Things will go wrong. You have to plan a backup. One of the reasons I have this sheet to give you, in addition to helping you not have to take notes, is that the thing might not work. You never know. More prep time. It takes more prep time whenever you use technology. Don't let anyone ever tell you that it takes less with any technology. It takes more. Amateurish look. Wow. So many of these things look amateurish. What younger people will say is it's cheesy. You know, we think we're being cool perhaps if we're a little bit older, but they look at it and they say this is cheesy stuff. And it's rather ironic because often PowerPoint type stuff is used to try to attract youth, or because they think that youth are visually oriented and therefore they have to have this sort of thing. And then it's done in such a way that it looks amateurish, and you're better off not doing it if it looks amateurish. Copyright issues, big problem. A lot of churches violate copyright. They just go out and steal images on the web and put them on. And that's not something that we should be doing. Some congregants do dislike this. I'll tell you, it's generally younger ones that dislike it more than older ones, but that's another story. It's difficult to use seamlessly, just like what I have right here now. I got this clicker. I'm going to try to move this thing. It goes to the wrong one. I'm talking. Where do I move around? What am I doing here? Okay, now I got it. It's interruption. And small interruptions with technology become big interruptions. If you're preaching without using something like projection technology and you speak the wrong word and you have to back up and correct yourself, or you do something a little bit silly, it's no big deal. In fact, it often endears people to you. But when you have a problem with something like technology, it stands out. I tell you why this is. We're so used to highly produced, big budget productions. We see it on TV, we see it in movies and everything. There's so much stuff out there that millions and millions of dollars has been put into. And it flows kind of seamlessly, this stuff. In fact, often some of the highest paid people are the editors that put it all together. So you never get a sense of something being out of place. And then we come in there and we're using this thing and it doesn't work seamlessly. It helps, it requires either technological collaboration, that is to say somebody who can work with you on it to do it if you can't do it or don't want to, and or collaboration skills with fitting stuff with sermons. So if you're not selecting your own images, if you're not working on, let's say, metaphors like Mary talked about, that you're going to use props and so on, if somebody else is helping you, you have to collaborate with them on that. And then maybe you have to collaborate with somebody on the technology of putting it together. And pretty soon you realize that you have to have some gift of collaboration, not just a gift of being able to think about what you're going to put into a presentation. This is one of the most important things, and I really like the way Mary emphasized it with preaching in general. Where's the focus? Where's the energy? Because what people look for with a preacher is the energy. They follow the energy. And the energy has to do a lot with the use of the body and the movement. Well, what happens when you use a screen? The energy begins to shift to the screen. And so the tendency is to say, I want energy on that screen. I want things moving. I want to use a lot of slides. Okay? If you've used audio, I'm going to try some video now. Keep it moving. There's energy up there. The problem with that is it shifts the energy from me up there. And we'll talk about in a couple of minutes how do we get it back once you've shifted it up there so that people don't think they're just sitting there watching a TV program or a movie or something. This is difficult to understand, but it does create a different context when you use presentation technology, because people come into church with the experience of the technology in other settings. And the two settings that they're most used to are business and education. So they assume that they're taking the position of somebody who's sitting in a PowerPoint presentation in a business meeting or in a classroom. And if we feed that, we can get into trouble. We have to do it in a way that's a little bit different. So what I'm doing right now with a lot of bullet points and numbering and everything, as a preacher, I would not do that. This is an educational thing. It's a little workshop. It's different context. So we have to be careful about talking about what the specific context is and then how to use it within that, and we'll cover that. Text itself is not visually interesting, even though it's visual. That's a downside. I'm curious about people who believe that just putting text on a screen itself is visually interesting. I think it'd be very hard to support that. Now, we could monkey around with it, right? Make fancy things happen to the text to make it a little more interesting. But in general, text itself is not visually interesting. I don't know why this thing is being so crazy here. Come on. Okay, so here are reasons to use, and then we'll talk about strategy as we go through these too. You can make small things visible to all. Small things visible to all. This is a marvelous thing. We have a great preacher at my church. I love going there for the worship, all of it. And his preaching is part of it. But he's very, very low tech. And sometimes he'll bring in something like a magazine article. And he'll hold this up for everybody to see. And of course, nobody can see it unless you're in the front couple of rows. Now, we're in a setting that's very hard to use any kind of projection because of the amount of ambient light. I've actually installed it and used it in there for some special events, but it's tough. So we're kind of stuck. What's he to do? Maybe not use any kind of prop like that. Small things can be made large. I wouldn't recommend this for props that are very tangible, like the tape that we used. To project the tape, people know what tape is. Everybody pretty much knows what it is. You can see it even at a distance and get a sense of it. I wouldn't use it for something like that, because it's not the same to see it as to see somebody holding it in 3D and feeling it. And you get a sense of right away. Didn't you all get a sense of what it felt like to hold that tape spool and what it feels like when you pull the tape out and all. And it's never quite as good when you do something like that on a screen. It aids congregational memory if used well. This is why you shouldn't use it. I've never used this thing before. And so we need to go to another one, huh? Oh, this is great. Okay, we'll do that again. Go to previous. Yeah, they told us when we got here that we didn't have any clicker or anything, so I didn't have a chance to practice with it. There was one stuck down under there, rather interesting. But think about the memory issue here. We are visual people in our memory, and this is true of text as well as other visuals. You've all had the experience where you were taking an exam on something, and you remembered where in the book that text appeared on the page, but you can't remember what it said. We are visual, all of us are. Some people more than others in terms of learning style. Learning style. Not necessarily in terms of their whole life, okay? To have somebody who's a visually attuned learner does not mean that they're necessarily going to dress in ways that are visually appropriate. There will be other aspects of their lives that are kind of a visual mess. But we do all remember some things visually, and so it does help. And it can help for the whole congregation, particularly to see the same kind of visuals over and over again. Emphasize key points. If we're talking about text, this is really what we're talking about, right? To emphasize key points. We'll talk about different kinds of key points. Visualize historical context. The historical context that you're preaching about. To illustrate contemporary culture, to give actual examples or illustrations from contemporary culture. This is why some preachers use film clips or clips from commercials or other items, magazine ads, and so on, where they can use something that is representative of what's happening in the broader culture, and maybe something that's really popular. It helps maintain multi-sermon themes. So there are some churches that are doing this quite well. You got a theme, 5, 6 sessions or whatever, and you're going to do something visually in the color you use, the kind of fonts you use, the kind of logo that's connected with that theme or whatever from week to week. And it helps with that. It's the same sort of thing that's been done with banners and other visuals in the church. Handouts, handouts that have certain thematic elements to them. Okay? Establishes shared visual knowledge. Now here's the issue. Anytime you're going to do something visually through words, you're going to paint a picture through words. If it's something that people are not already familiar with, you're going to have a hard time explaining it with words, getting them up to snuff. So if you can show it, suddenly everybody sees it right away, and you don't have to explain it with words before you talk about it. So there's some benefit. I'm interested in this intergenerational issue where you have congregations with a lot of younger people who have a whole repertoire of images and sounds from their culture, and you have older members who don't have any of that. And what does the preacher do if the preacher is going to use sound or visuals? What do you select from? I think you select those things in particular that you need to make sure everybody's on the same page with, so they have a shared background on these things, and you don't just assume it. The assuming about cultural references in sermons is quite an issue today because everything is so balkanized. And I remember when I was growing up in Chicago with 3 major networks, you could mention practically any TV show and almost everybody would have been familiar with it. And now my students come to me and they say, have you seen this or that or whatever that's really popular with young people? I've never heard of it. I have to go track it down and figure out what it's about. So the technology allows me to demonstrate some of that and bring up to snuff people who are not familiar with it. Greater visual variety. The idea here is visual variety, not visuals per se. We had a great question earlier about how much is too much, should you use it every week or whatever, and we can talk about those things and discuss them. But the idea of visual variety is important. Variety in how you use your body as well as how you use the technology. And it can aid those with hearing difficulties. Very important. Okay, so 10 reasons to use. This thing is not working the way it's supposed to. Come on, buddy. You can do it. Here's what's going on. I've taken a lot of examples from a lot of churches to try to figure out how are people actually using this stuff well. What are the basic uses? And this is what I've come up with so far. If you have more, let's add them to the list. But for biblical text, this is obvious. People are putting biblical text up. They're projecting it. And sometimes they are reading it. Sometimes they're having other people reading it. Sometimes they're putting music up with it and letting people read it on their own. But they're projecting text. Then we get into what I talked about a little bit earlier, historical illustration. So you're preaching on a particular text, and there's something about that setting, that place, that time, the cultural artifacts, the look of the land, whatever. And you can use words to try to explain that to people, but you might find a couple of really great images that will help immediately for people to sense that context. Now, we've got the copyright issues, we got the research issues and the time involved in finding this stuff, but there is a lot out there, and there's a lot on websites that allows you to use the material as well. Got outlining going on, similar to what used to happen with the paper handout, right? People would hand out something with a bulletin or whatever, and it would have a little outline of the sermon just to help people follow or to take notes if they wanted. And this is going on as well with projection. I haven't been able to figure out if the churches in general that are projecting outline are then not handing something out. That seems to me to be, if outlining is important for the way somebody preaches and the way a congregation likes to be communicated with, then it seems to me you'd still want to use the paper anyway. But maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe the times are different, and people seeing it up there and listening to it are going to be able to keep track of it just as well as if they had it in paper and were writing down notes. For contemporary illustration, you used to talk about hermeneutics as text, context, and application. Here I'm talking about application. How does what you're talking about relate to what's going on in contemporary culture? And again, you can explain what's going on in contemporary culture using words, using your body, and acting it out and so on. But you can also do examples or illustrations from actual contemporary culture. Almost every church that I've run across so far that's using video clips is using it for this purpose. I've run across a few that use it for sort of an opening at the beginning of the sermon to get people's attention or whatever topically. But it doesn't really relate that much to application. And finally, using it for definition, to define things. So there are key words or key theological concepts or whatever, and they're putting up definitions of those. And it seems to me very helpful. Here are some examples of where this is being done in different churches. I'm going to turn the light down here just so you can see this a little bit better. So here's a typical simple screen. By the way, blue is generally thought to be the best color. Like a royal blue, a fairly dark blue similar to what I'm using for readability and all. And so you find that being done quite a bit. Nothing exciting about this. It's straight text. It's very readable. It's not too small. My guess is people could see it throughout. Creates a little bit of dissonance because you've got, in this case, a pastor down below who's probably reading it. Do people look at the person reading it? Do they look up above at the text? A little bit of dissonance there, but not bad. Most people probably look at the text. Here's another example. This is thematic, talking about stewardship, talking about money, and probably illegally stealing the kind of monopoly images from the game. Don't know about that. Here's Rob Bell. Interesting use of pointing people to the text rather than putting the text up there. This church is in a very big venue, and the screens are not that large, and you cannot put a lot of text on there and have everybody see it. You can use it for Scripture, but you can't put much up at a time. And so they hand out Bibles, and they point people to the page on the assumption that everybody will have the Bible that they're handing out and won't have brought their own. Illustration. I can't remember what Vicki was preaching on this now, but this was at Centerpoint Church here in town, and which did a lot with visuals. And she was making a point using this particular image. And they did a lot of good work on the use of visual metaphor as props. Okay? Some of the secret churches I've been at, by the way, use almost no projected props. It's almost all stuff like boats and other things they bring up on, and they don't do much with projecting it. This is outlining, essentially. Here's a definition. It's clear there's nothing fancy about it. It's dignified. It doesn't get in the way. And people will actually remember it better if they see it in text as well as hear it. Okay. There's a lot of discussion among people who study communication and the use of PowerPoint in particular about how much is too much, how little is not enough. And one of the rules that is getting the most discussion is this rule by Guy Kawasaki. And you can go and read more about it at the address that I put on your handout. Guy Kawasaki he calls himself a Mac evangelist, that is the Mac computer. And he came up with what he calls the 10-20-30 rule. A maximum of 10 slides, maximum of 20 minutes long, a minimum of 30-point font. And then I put in there for this one, that's an example of 32-point font. Now, debates raging about this stuff. The problem with a rule like this, of course, is that it's not contextual. What about a business setting? What about an education setting? What about a sermon setting? But I don't think it's that far off for sermons. If I had to vote for it as a general rule to kind of shoot for in sermons, I would say, yeah, it's pretty good. 10 slides, 20 minutes. Again, that depends a lot on the congregation and what they like. 30-point font, hey, I'll stick with that. Go ahead. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. There you go. So you got to test it out in the setting. I've been in a couple of churches that are using these plasma and LCD screens, and then they cascade them along. So they'll have, let's say, 3 different locations on either side where they'll have one, because they don't have a good place to project. And boy, they are really stuck in terms of size. You know, that, I don't know if that's even worth doing, frankly. But there's this sense that you kind of have to be with the times, and so they put something like that in. Okay, here are tips. Now we're into the nitty-gritty of using this stuff. Don't look at the screen. Maintain eye contact with the congregation. Now, this is tough. This is tough because the screen becomes the focus. But the screen is really the support for what you're saying. The screen is not what you're saying. It's the support. So you want people to be looking at you. And the eye contact thing is the most important. I've been teaching for just over 30 years, and I can tell you that eye contact is one of the most important things in getting students interested in what I'm talking about. If I don't have eye contact with them, I'm in trouble. Okay, so what do I do if I'm using PowerPoint eye contact? All right, I move away from the screen to regain the focus, see? So now I can point to the screen. This is a terrible situation here because the screen is so big, it's in the middle of the room, right? If I stand over here now, I'm blocking. This thing really, it eats the whole room up. I much prefer having a somewhat smaller screen off into the corner, if possible. Because then what I can do, if it's up in this corner, is I can go over and, if I need to point to it for a second, for a definition or something, but then I'm right back to the people. And then as I start to walk over here, and I've got the eye contact going, they're with me. They're not with that anymore. If they want to go back and look at that, to remember it, they can do that. So you use your body and the eye contact in order to have people with you, to move them to the screen when you need to move them away from it when you need to. This is the toughest thing to learn how to do with any kind of projection well, because the tendency is to want to look all the time at it, refer to it all the time, and the screen itself becomes the whole focus of the communication. It becomes, if you will, the text of the sermon, because people are looking at it all the time, they're reading it, they're thinking about it, and they're not necessarily paying attention to you. Employ a monitor if you can. The best monitor situation, so you know what's up there, and when something is up there and not up there and so on, is to have a monitor in the back that you can see. Sometimes, if this were a pulpit, let's say, and you preach behind a pulpit, and you've got a monitor down here that you can kind of glance at to see where it's at, that can work too. But monitors are important if you want to do this fairly seamlessly. So you know where you're at. You don't have to be looking at it all the time. Where am I? Use a remote clicker, one that you know how to use. Right? Very important. And there are small ones. This is some Star Trek thing. I don't know what to make of it. But there are small ones that, you know, will just move forward or whatever. You can have other people do it. I operated it for Mary as best I could. And I said, you know, give me the left finger kind of thing over there when you're ready for it. So you don't have to say, you know, now you're ready, and you point over there and make a big thing out of when the next one is. But if you can do that yourself and move it along, it's much better. And then tap the B key for black screen. Or have a way to cue somebody to tap the B screen. Okay? What is it? Look at this. I just hit B and it's gone. There are times when you don't want anything up there. You want to make sure the focus is on what you're saying. You want to make sure that you're connecting with people. Are you with me? So you knock that thing out. Get it out of there. Either through some kind of signal you have with somebody that you can give them the point to do it, or do it yourself. And you can bring it back on. The best actually is where the screen comes on and off as needed. Okay? That's very tough to do well, seamlessly, but that's the best. Because there are people around who will look at that screen no matter if it's the same for 5 minutes and it's 6 words up there. One definition. They'll look at that the whole time. I have tested students in Calvin's own classrooms, these redeemed covenant children. And if I go in the classroom with something, with the screen lit up with nothing on it, the students will be looking at that. Blank screen, but there's light up there. They're expecting, they're looking at it. What's going to happen? They're excited. By the way, I found on one of these websites for materials for pastors to use with PowerPoint, you can buy these animated countdowns. So it'll start like 60 seconds, 58 seconds, 50, you know, down. And then you can put in there what's coming, you know. Countdown to righteousness or something, I don't know. Put in there whatever you want, or self-righteousness or something. And you count it down. And I was thinking about that. Why would they provide that? Why would anyone have to create that to put in? And it's exactly this thing, right? They're trying to use the screen, which they know people will pay attention to once they walk in there, rather than chatting with other people or looking at their materials or whatever, to kind of focus people on worship. We can talk about whether or not that's an appropriate way to do it. That's a whole different issue. But it struck me as making sense that that's what they would do. So then I go back and I hit my B, and I got it right back again. Oh, the Lord provides the B key, the shut-off, right? Hey, this thing's actually working. Oh, no. It's going to foul up again. Clear, contrasting text. I won't say much about that other than do it. Keep the design clean and simple, even dignified. After all, this is worship, right? Avoid slide transition effects. And I've seen it all done. Most of those transition effects in the sermon that I demonstrated for you were in there. In fact, I don't think I added any transition effects. And added a few of the sounds and all. And animation effects to have stuff moving around. Parallel form for text lists. Very important. If you are going to list, let's say you've got 3 points or 4 points, make sure they're in parallel form. So this is use, avoid, don't, use, avoid, whatever. Okay? So they're in parallel form. I'm emphatically saying to you, do this or don't do that. If one is a noun and one is a verb, or one begins with a noun and one begins with a verb, it's much more difficult for people to sense what the organization is of the points. So parallel form is incredibly important. My students really like it. They say it helps them remember, and it helps them to know what's expected of them if I do it right. Avoids this, you know what the stereotypical spiritual images are to avoid, right? Water, a waterfall, got some nice clouds. That's spiritual. Clouds are spiritual. What else? Evil? Eagle. The eagle. There you go. Excellent. Mountaintops. Cross is an interesting one. I don't know if you noticed or not, but I tried to select a theme here that would have a little bit of a cross. And I think it can be done in subtle ways. Hey, buddy, the problem, of course, there is a lot of it is really kind of silly looking, right? It's not cross like you'd ever see. It's a cross that just somebody created as a cross that is in general people's minds that's the stereotypical cross. Go ahead.
All of the things you said not to use are usually exactly what you find on the front of a bulletin cover.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't use them on PowerPoint even though it'd be on the bulletin.
A bulletin is generally black and white or black and beige or something. And it's a whole different situation than when you introduce color and you project it on the screen. This becomes gaudy really fast. So I wouldn't worry as much about bulletins cover. You certainly want it to be nicely done. But I don't even know if I've ever seen a cross in a bulletin cover that I thought was silly in the way it was done. Anybody else have a thought on that or anything else related to bulletins? That's a great point. This thing went ahead, huh? So now we've got to go back here again. Know thy pointer. Know thy pointer. Okay, we're going to pull it down here just so I can get to the rest of the points. Well, you actually got them on there. I don't even need to do much with them, do I? Stating the obvious. If it's something that's really obvious, just state it, right? You don't need to put it in a PowerPoint. And I think that is one of the biggest mistakes, by the way, that people make. They put a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of what they put on is the obvious, which is really, if you don't need to illustrate something, if you don't need to imprint something in memory, if you don't need to develop something thematically from week to week, then it probably doesn't belong in projection. It's just noise. It's filler. So I'd stay away from it. related to that is use only what you need to show then, right? And avoid reading the text on the screen and preach it instead. And that goes back to what Mary was talking about. So, Mary, why don't you come up? We'll do these questions together because we'll talk about body and screen together. The incarnational and the non-incarnational. I don't think I'll need to show anything more, so I'm just going to turn it off. Okay, what do you think? Other ideas or thoughts? Go ahead.
Just a comment. I agree as far as images, as far as examples. I try to stay away from the say with historical images. Collected number of photographs of Israel, places to illustrate things that are probably hard for people to imagine if they've never seen them themselves. But on the other hand, you said something very early on about projecting words on the screen. How you initially said they aren't all that terribly interesting. But then later on in your presentation, you spoke about, well, you can use like dignified font, that kind of thing. When I put words on a screen, it's usually like a move or something like that. To use an example, for those who were at the worship service last evening, in the FAC conference.
Oh, yeah.
One of his phrases was, "You don't belong." That's like that would be a phrase I would put up, and I would circle back to that and have people. If you put that in words, and you have them look at it, you come back to those words, and then perhaps time, later on when I can tell them. And in some ways, it's a point that it's something you return to, think about it, and then you come back to it. It's something that is a visual, imprinted on.
Yeah, it's a memory device, and that's good, I think. You want to say anything about that?
Well, I think often, yeah, it's good. If you're doing it well rhetorically, you don't have to do it on the screen. But that also depends on your context. Some people are really good at listening well to people talking, and they get it. If you're repeating a phrase, they're going to pick it up. For other people, they don't listen to that on a regular basis, and so for them to see it is a better thing. And that's where knowing your audience is so important, right? Now, for Frank Thomas, I didn't hear him last night. I'll probably hear him tonight. And for someone like that, like you remember it still today. So obviously he presented it in a way that was memorable. So my guess is it was an incarnational moment where the "you don't belong in the family" and then the "compel them to come in" were presented in such a way in an embodied form that it stuck with you. So don't rely on the higher tech stuff to do stuff that you can do, lower tech, and actually connect easier. I would much rather have somebody look me in the eye and say, "You don't belong in the family," and then compel them to come in, than to be looking up there and have it say, "You don't belong in the family," compel them to come in. You know what I mean? Just as a communicator, I don't think you can beat somebody who's really passionate about what they're doing and saying it right up front. Again, this has to support whatever you are doing. And if the power went out, I still want you to be able to preach a good sermon.
I guess, and I see where you're coming from. In some ways, some of my philosophy of using technology is something that is part of the church. Kind of an expectation that I use it, and I wasn't necessarily opposed to it, and it's a helpful tool. But I always kind of go into the sermon to say, it goes back to what you said at the very beginning. If you can't preach a sermon without it, it's the same thing. If the power went out, would I still be able to preach this?
Yep. Yep, that's exactly right. And being a guest preacher, I'll get people to say, what's your PowerPoint? Do you have? I'm like, no. They'll be like, what? Because in some churches, they just always have it. And so for them not to have it then is, like, usually there are two people in the back who just don't know what they're supposed to do then, right? And I say, well, you just get to listen today. You don't have to, manage anything. So I don't mind mixing it up for people, too.
Start by the comment that you made, that people look at the screen. Do you think it would be best if I did do that? If I have the key point and then just had nothing on the screen and then later on go to the next point? Or I do it that way?
That's what I would do.
Yeah, I think I would take the latter approach, but I would also check with people in your congregation to see what they prefer and what they say works better for them. I'm not sure there's a hard and fast rule on it.
The simple question is, where do you want their eyes to be? Where do you want their eyes to be? Do you want them to be on you so that your eyes can be on them, or do you want them to be on the screen? And anytime you want them to be on you, mute the screen. Hit the B button. Yeah. Yeah, you can do that too. Build in a blank screen into your slide presentation. But I find too with students, or it's like when you go to Chili's or any of these restaurants that have televisions all around, I can be with someone who is captivating and intelligent and funny, and my eyes are still going to be on the sports game that's on up above, even if I'm not interested in it. Even if it's two teams from the SEC that I never watch, I don't care. My eyes are going to go there because that I expect something to happen. It's like the kids in Quinn's classroom. If you see a screen and it's on, you expect that something's going to happen. And so if it's not going to happen, then mute the screen. So, yeah.
Two observations I've got from my experience in terms of how people see things or see technologies. I sit on a grants panel, and the number of grant applications we have that, even if it's not in the text, it's we have observed growing churches have projection, therefore if we have projection we will grow.
Right.
You have to work on that one. And the other thing is sometimes which goes back to the preaching thing actually, is the temptation to do the Fox News thing that actually will have less content and more whiz.
Yeah.
Because that distracts people from the fact that we've actually said nothing for 20 minutes. But for 20 minutes we've run the same headline backwards and forwards.
Yes.
With the same clip. But nothing's happened. And actually
Right.
we want people to grow, not just have their eyes watched over.
Exactly right. Yeah, I run into the same thing with, the truth is a church grows because the Spirit blesses the people and they invite people in. End of the story, And the other thing is that I don't know of a church that's growing really, really well that doesn't have a preacher that's actually preaching the Word. I don't know of one. I'd love to see it. I haven't seen it yet. So that means I, as a preacher, have work to do, and I want my sermon to be really well-crafted, and I want it to be thoughtful, and I want to engage the Word well and teach my people how to engage the Word well. And I don't want them to think that they have to have all sorts of techie stuff or that the Bible is something I can play with. I want them to know that the Bible is something that transforms our lives. And this is also why I don't like it when there are like 12 different Bible passages for one particular sermon. It's just a whole thing I have, like pick one and go with it. So you do get the techie stuff, and people think, oh, if we just have the equipment, then we'll be able to do it. But you also need somebody who can run the equipment. You need somebody who can come up with really good designs for things. You need a team to run the equipment well. Just like you need a team to staff the nursery, you need a team to be in the choir, you actually need a technology team. So don't just spend $1,500 on the equipment, because that doesn't suddenly make people come to your church, right? So be aware. Train people to use it well. Robert?
How about projecting the scriptures on as they're being read? Because before we had the screen, people were looking at a book and reading it out of the book while it was being read. Now at least they're looking up what's being read.
I don't think that's a big gain or loss either way. I want people to read the Bible.
I have a
Full stop.
One of my wife's colleagues, John Bell, says that the projecting and even putting the Bible on the bulletin board actually takes from the people's hands that which they gained at the Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
Because they
Yep.
you have now decided that they can only see those 6 verses.
Right.
They can't go, oh, blimey, he was there before. Or,
Right.
I'll
Look
read
at the
that
whole book.
later on.
Engage the book. Exactly right.
What this thing is, it's not a
Yep.
series of headlines.
Yep.
It's a whole book.
when I'm reading Scripture, I don't care where people are looking in the sense, but when I read Scripture, I want to bring all the drama to the reading of it. So that whether they're looking at me or their eyes are on the page, they're hearing the story afresh and alive. I find that happens a lot better when people aren't looking at a screen and reading along. So I think we may gain when people sing and their heads are up out of the book because they're participating in worship in a way that you want their bodies to be up and alive and open. But when they're reading Scripture and their heads are down and they're holding onto the book, I think that's a really good form. We have lots of hands up. Go ahead.
Are there ways that you would encourage us to use video?
No. Next. Let me talk a little bit about video. If you're going to use a video clip, use an unfamiliar video clip. Don't use a video clip that everybody has seen before. So, for example, don't use an image from Forrest Gump and play 2 minutes out of it because you know what everybody else's brain does for the rest of your sermon? Finishes the movie. So if you have an unfamiliar video clip, play it. Let me give you an example. I have a student who preached a sermon, not for me in class, but was telling me about it. And at the very beginning, he played the clip of a Marine talking about Psalm 91 and the role that Psalm 91 played in his life being overseas. It was a 2-minute clip. And from that, he went into the sermon. Well, you had to see that 2-minute clip to get what he was saying. It was an unfamiliar video clip. It was at the front of the sermon. He played it, and it built and it flowed right into the rest of his sermon. If you play 5 minutes of Spider-Man in the middle of your sermon, you're not getting people back. So if it's a familiar clip, just describe it. Many of us have seen the scene from Indiana Jones and the whatever it was, when he has to cross the big thing and he can't see it and he has to take a leap of faith, right? And he has to stand out. And so many of you have seen this, right? Well, you can just describe it and act it out. You don't have to like show the clip. The other thing that I've seen some preachers do is they'll play the clip with no sound in the back as they're talking. Many of you know what this scene is. This is the scene from Indiana Jones in the Temple of whatever, and he does the thing. You know this scene, and he has to take the leap of faith. So the focus is still on me and what I'm saying, but the image is just back there playing with no sound for about 30 seconds. So familiar things, when we play familiar films, we're losing people. Their brains are gone. That's like letting a little rabbit loose, and they're just following a little rabbit. So that's what I recommend. If it's an unfamiliar film clip, play it. If it's familiar, either describe it or have it playing in the back muted. That's my 2 cents. And have them in the beginning of the sermon and not at the end. I think you should have nothing on the screen at the end of the sermon. I think it should be you talking about what God is doing, has done, will do. It's got to be human to human at the end of the sermon. That's my opinion. Yeah.
We always hear sometimes it's the medium of the message. So what does technology and the use of it communicate about God in both of your minds?
I think technology can support the communication about God that the preacher does. The preacher is still the medium. And that's why I say your body has to support your preaching, your voice has to support your preaching, and whatever's on a screen has to support you are the medium. So technology comes along and assists you and helps you to flourish, but if it distracts from you, if it makes your life harder, if you're up Saturday night at 11:30 Googling images for a sermon, hey, let's do a sober reality check. That's just not how you're supposed to spend your time. So I think technology can teach people also too much that God is distant, that faith is observational, that worship is observational, that there's a screen up there and I just get to watch and observe and pay attention and go on my merry way, as opposed to what we really know discipleship is, which is full body contact with the Holy Spirit. That's the deal. So those are my fears about technology and worship, that it makes it observational. You've had your hand up a long time.
Let me address this one.
Yeah.
That's a great question, and it requires a complicated answer to do it justice. I would just say that we are multimedia creatures. That's the way we're made. We are visual even if we don't project something. We speak, we hear, we touch, we smell. So we are multimedia. The only question is, what is right and fitting for a given context. And notice I didn't say what is necessarily effective. I said what's right and fitting. Because you can also become manipulative of people, become effective in ways that are not right and fitting. And so for worship, we need to figure out in a given context the kind of worship that we have in a particular church, the style of worship, the abilities of the preacher, the appropriateness for a given topic or a given series, the availability of good resources, and so on. Always with communication as the goal, not with technology as the goal, not with trying to force technology into something that it's not going to be right and fitting for, but communication is the goal. So I like Augustine, who borrowed from Cicero the idea that every sermon, Cicero said every public speech, should inform, persuade, and delight. Inform, persuade, or the literal translation from the Latin would be move and delight. And I think we kind of want to do all three of those always. And to the extent that the technology can support the legitimate purposes in a given context, then I'm all for it. But I don't see that's what's going on. I see that the McLuhan term, the medium as the message, has got people thinking, well, if I just get the right technology, we're going to get the impact that we want. And McLuhan never meant that. And so I think we need to stay away from that kind of simplistic thinking. Good question.
I'm wondering how where you make a decision in this between the style of the preacher and the wants or areas of the congregation. My church has overhead, but I think we worship with people putting more stuff in sermons up on the overhead and so forth. And I struggle with it a lot. I mean, I'm not sure it's music myself. And I don't know that maybe there are ways to do it. I mean, most of the things that I always make, I'm limited in what I've seen, but most of the ones that I've seen on PowerPoint and so forth, were bad terms. It's very consistent things. And very fluffy. But that's probably biased with me as well. But I mean, I tend to do more narrative both terms, which I'm not sure goes there. But the congregation, people in the congregation will say, you just use it more. And I'm wondering, where do you find that balance?
So part of the context is the way you preach. And that is a very important consideration. And for you to change the way you preach in a way that doesn't seem to fit with you and doesn't seem to fit with how best you want to communicate with the congregation is not right. So that may be one response to that, is this is not exactly me and it doesn't fit in with the way I preach, but I'll use it as appropriate. Now again, I don't know you and don't know the church context, but if communication is the goal, then it's not a matter of use it more or use it less. It's looking at the whole context and what's going on.
Yeah, I see the communication goal. For me personally, I think that should be better through words. I think for me personally, the PowerPoint stuff would be more distracting. There may be ways for the images.
Well, let me push on this a little bit then, just in terms of the historical illustration, how you would think about that. If you how do you describe something that's a historical setting that's important to understand in Scripture? Do you feel... Yeah. Okay. Right. The more didactic stuff, right?
But then it's still a question, for me personally, communicating, I think, is better to tell it. But then the question, what's more important, the way I feel about communicating or how the congregation continues to communicate? And if the congregation is saying, many are saying, you need to see this better, it's up there, then that's my biggest struggle.
Do you preach with a manuscript? I'm going to encourage you, instead of getting all whiz-bang with technology, to move to preaching with a minimum of notes, and then move to preaching without notes. And this may take, I mean, it took me about 15 years. So, yeah. Great. Good. Because my guess is the more you move toward fully incarnational preaching, the less there will be this need from the congregation for, we need a little bit more to help us figure out where you're going. No, I know. It's always, and it could be the people for whom that's their learning style. Their learning style is bullet points, and I need it laid out. And so you may want to try just giving them either your notes that you're preaching from ahead of time. Just say, well, here's where I'm going. Just give it to like 2 or 3 people. Say, was this helpful to you? Was it not? Just try things. Every Sunday is a lab. We get to try stuff. So just try things. Give them an outline. Give them to the 10 people. Was this helpful? Was it not? Would it be more helpful on the screen or off the screen? Just try things out. And so maybe you put things on the screen for your sermon 4 or 5 times a year, and then just see. I was always struck when I would do, and I very rarely did the first point, the second point, the third point of the day. I would get a completely different group of people who would come up to me afterwards and say, well, that sermon was really good. And it was because that fit their learning style. So as we serve our audience, we need to pay attention to not only what serves us well, but what's going to serve them well. So every now and then I would try and craft a sermon that was much more didactic, and here we're going to go. And but it's all about knowing your context and serving your audience well. So. Yeah. 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 Absolutely. When it's done well, it's just great. It's so hard to do it well, and rarely done well.
Mary and I are working together on this topic related to preaching in particular. And so I made the decision not to give bigger context to the presentation I did here, so we would just fit this in with preaching. You're absolutely right that there's a bigger context, and that high-tech worship book that I wrote is designed to look at the bigger context, because at the time I wrote it, I felt like people didn't understand that you fit technology to worship. You don't fit worship to technology. It was backwards. But at that time, the big thing was to use projection for primarily lyrics. And now it's moved more toward use in sermons. So we're focusing a little more narrowly on that. I think the high-tech worship book still holds up well as a guide for what to do in general, but it doesn't provide enough for preaching. And so that's what we're hoping to work on with this.
We're starting to get, at least in our community, silver screen type place where you have a pastor in one church, and he'll broadcast his message to maybe a dozen different locations. There's no pastor there. They just get a live feed from his. I'm nervous about a lot of that because it's usually independent, and one danger is that God is whoever they decide he is, and they can create God in their own image if they choose. But also I wonder why that works. Why is it okay to have a big screen and a pastor in Oakville broadcasting to Montreal and Barrie and all over Ontario? How does that work and get 1,500 people in a good building?
I take the question about these multi-site churches to be of 2 kinds. One is those that simply grew beyond what they could handle, and they tried to figure out what to do. We could discuss what they should have done. My preference is that they would take the money that they have and invest it in training more preachers for more locations, rather than put the money into technologically delivering, as they say, the sermon or the service, whatever, in other locations. It seems to me that what I've argued for is more of an incarnate and parish kind of model. But there's another reason that this is happening, and that has to do with the personalities of some preachers. There's something about their ability as communicators where they attract followers. I won't say they could say almost anything, but they're just really gifted orators. And people want to go to hear that person. Sometimes it's a person that's biblical, and sometimes it's a person who's not. But you get these kind of, what I called in a book some years back, personality cults. Followers of certain people. And so that's a whole different thing that's happened than just getting too large and trying to figure out what to do with it. But they both represent interesting problems. What do you think about those?
I used to be more resistant to them until I realized that the generations that are coming up are very used to having relationships with screens. And for me, I want a live person on Sunday morning preaching to me and be surrounded by live people. But that's not a need that other people have. On the flip side, I've also had people 20 years younger than me who say, I look at screens all week. I do not want to look at them at church. So you get kind of the both and for both those. But it's kind of like the fact that I've never seen Barack Obama speak live, but I have watched his speeches on YouTube, like downloaded in a tiny little screen, and I have been moved by them because he's a very good orator. You could say whether you agree or disagree with what he's saying, but there's this sense that we have so shaped our culture to be responsive to being moved by screens that why wouldn't this also come into play in the life of a congregation? Why wouldn't this happen? That people would say, oh, I can happily do a live worship band and worship with everybody, and then when the sermon comes up, we'll see Jeff just like everybody else in the chapel is seeing Jeff, and the people out in wherever are seeing Jeff. We'll all be united in that moment. So even though we're separated by different locations, we're united around this thing, and I'm part of this church as much as people who are all out and about. So it's a really interesting phenomenon.
Isn't there some danger to it?
Of course there are dangers to it. There are lots of dangers to it. There are dangers about celebrity worship. There are dangers about power outages. There are dangers about what are we saying theologically about the role of the preacher in the life of the congregation. I think a preacher does really well when he or she knows the lives of their congregants. But sometimes, once you hit about 700 people, you've kind of reached that threshold anyway. So it's an interesting conversation. We're about to the end of our time. I'm happy to hang around and talk, but I don't want to prevent you from getting lunch and then getting to your next thing. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks for participating. We very much appreciate your good questions, and enjoy the rest of your day.